Full house. Thank you for being here. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.
When I set up this panel a few months ago, I didn't think open source was going to be such a hot topic that everybody wanted to talk about suddenly. So I feel very smart right now.
Timing's everything.
Good timing. And actually, let's talk about that for a second, because in part it's AI that has made open source such a hot topic, because nobody really knows what an open source AI model is. We've had the OSI's definition of what that is. The 1.0 came out yesterday. But talk to me about how you guys think about that in your business. As what even is an open source model?
An open source AI model.
AI model, yeah. Not business model. We'll talk about that too.
I mean, if you look at the history of open source, right? It's not unusual that we go through these waves where there's a project or a new license that comes out, and then we go through iterations, right? And I think we're at the start of yet another one of those waves. Models are not exactly code. They come with a lot of other aspects and properties that make them work and usable. And so we're going to go through this evolution of like, okay, what is right that creates community, that creates distribution, that creates innovation around the project, and subsequently can create businesses around it as well. And so I think this is just a natural part of evolution and these waves, these tech waves that we go through.
I'd agree with that. I think, with the Meta Llama family of models, I think the definition is shifting a little bit, because now models are, as you said, it's more than just the model itself. It's the weights, it's the training code, it's the data. For the most recent versions of Llama, that's not fully available, and so it'd be nice to have a slightly more expanded definition, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, I'd just add that I'm not sure who cares what the OSI says anymore, even including themselves.
Fighting words.
Rowan, coming off the...
No, but I mean, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg is going to stop calling Llama open source. I don't think the community particularly cares. If it could be more open, that might be good in terms of weights and so on and so forth. But I think the key thing, at least what we've struggled with in the kind of little tech, big tech, battle that's been ongoing, is the protection against taking Llama or any other open source, quote unquote, and shipping it in your cloud in your monopolistic cloud service, and giving it away for free, or sort of unfairly taking advantage of the community's work. That's the key thing, I think, that's in that definition. As you said earlier, it doesn't include any protections, and that's the key definition that Llama put into their open source license that I think has been excluded. So it feels like a pedantic legacy conversation around what is open source.
I'm sorry.
So I think that's a big part of judging the outcomes, right? Judging the outcomes of a license. I think there's always an important element that is the users and the community and the innovation that comes around those projects, right? So to your point, definitions on paper are less important than does the community pick it up? Do they take it forward? Do you see additional innovation around that? Do you see businesses being constructed around that? Which is also a complement to what you just said, which is our business is also eroded as a result of the license. And so it's that balance.
Right, because we've seen these communities just spring up around these models now very quickly, but faster than around any of the closed models that Google and others are putting out there. So,
I mean, I think everyone, at least everyone who I read and care about, has said, well, this is great. Mark and the team did an amazing thing. They made it open source. Then you have this little, again, somewhat pedantic argument about, well, that's not really open source. I don't know. And according to this latest definition, it's not.
Right, it's not.
So let's see if Mark changes his language. That'll be the test.
Or does it matter? Exactly.
Or does it matter?
I give them, it's a custom license, so by the OSI definition, it's not technically open source. I think stepping back, one of the things that you never want to do is break the trust of the community that you're building. And I think to their credit, they've been very obviously with the license, they're very straightforward with exactly what they're putting forth. And I think that's been an important part of building trust with the community and the whole ecosystem that could develop around it.
Yeah, and all of this comes down to the discussion we've had in the open source ecosystem for years now, which is the licensing debate, right? Which, Rowan at Redis, you've gone through various changes over the years. Docker has made changes, At this point, if you think back to the changes you've made at Redis, for example, where clearly you were competing with AWS and others, and they were taking your code. Do you feel good about where you are right now with the changes you've made?
Yeah, we feel good. So, we made a change earlier this year to move to the SSPL, the Software Service Provider License, that is exactly the same as what we were with BSD3 clause, except for the additional protection that you see in the Llama license, which is a cloud service provider can't take this code and host it and sell it without contributing back, essentially. So we think that's a great license. That's what we've been using. That's what Mongo uses. That's what Elasticsearch was using until they recently went back to open source. I thought that was a really interesting development. I think what it's demonstrating is at the heart of these companies, including Redis, is strong community inclinations, and we would like to be fully open, and we are with this exception of this one clause. And so I think that's the key difference. And frankly, again, it's a little bit like I feel the industry is being gaslit at scale, to be honest, around this specific part of the open source license definition.
I think Rowan nailed it. And Casey went there as well, which is like setting expectations with the community and then being consistent about that is how you build trust in the long run, in the long game. And I think there's been various lessons learned with folks on stage, but also, of course, the audience on that. And I'll share with our own journey. So Docker's never changed its open source license. We've been Apache v2 since the beginning. What we did change, with also full communication to the community about what we were doing, is we changed the commercial license of Docker Desktop. So Docker Desktop was always a commercially licensed product. It was never 100% open source. It includes open source components and technology. And what we did in the August 2021 timeframe is change it from a commercial license that was 100% freely available to a commercial license that was free for most of the community, like tens of millions of members of the community. But if you were a company of a certain scale and size and using it for commercial purposes, then in order to reinvest in the product and reinvest in the community, it came with a commercial pay-for license. But we had to be very, very intentful about where we're going and why we're doing it. And then we had to follow up with plowing the proceeds back into the product to demonstrate that we weren't just grabbing cash, but we were in fact investing in innovation for, again, tens of millions that got it for free and a very small subset that had to pay for it.
And Docker is an interesting example, right? Because Docker in its early years got basically disrupted by an open source product, Kubernetes, coming out of Google. And you also made, frankly, some mistakes probably, but do you worry about that today? Is that still on your mind?
Well, I hope every startup entrepreneur in the audience, as well as Rowan, were growth companies. Only the paranoid survive. I mean, you can never be just like, hey, we got this, done. Like, tell me, entrepreneurs in the audience, if you wake up every day, you feel that, like, that should be a sign or a warning sign. Look, when a market is emerging, there's no standards and there's no definitions. And so what you're alluding to, what Fred was alluding to, is in the early days, containers came on the scene 2013, 2014. Everything was up for grabs. And what we saw pretty quickly emerging from 2013 into 2014, that there's so many containers being created that there was a need for an orchestration layer on top. And Google, to their credit, joined the community, had Google Kubernetes as a layer over that. They're still running Docker containers underneath that layer, and then we had a competing product, Docker Swarm, and there's a whole bunch of lessons learned. We're not going to take up the rest of the panel on kind of where to compete, how to compete, what your competitive advantages are. Pleased to say that as a developer-focused company, we're still alive. Kubernetes is our best friend now because that's where the containers get deployed to. And again, the long game with the community, things work out, but you got to be intentful on where you're going.
Now, from the investor perspective, as you're talking to these early stage companies and they come to you and they say, I'm an open source company, what kind of conversations do you have with them at that point?
It's funny to me because I realize the topic of this panel is what is an open source business model, but to me, open source sort of just means software these days. So I think it's sort of a catch-all. It really is just a catch-all phrase, and I really think of it as sort of just what is your distribution model for this? With founders that I talk to who are building open source projects and starting to think about companies, it is one of the things that they're probably most nervous about is like how they're going to communicate this to the community. I always view that as a really positive sign. You want to over-communicate. They're very intentional now with exactly how they think about licensing very early on in the company days, which I think is, they're learning from other companies that came before them. But I do think that is an important conversation to have. And then this is sort of maybe interesting advice, but I always encourage founders actually to monetize a little bit earlier. I think some of you might be seed stage founders or Series A founders in the open source space. I think when the community doesn't know what the commercial product is going to be, you actually just get a lot more anxiety and paranoia. And so once you create that first cloud service, it actually just answers questions for the community. And I think that's super important.
I think the intentionality just cannot be underweighted here. Like we spend the rest of the panel just on this, probably lessons learned from the School of Hard Knocks. But so it's intentionality around licensing. It's intentionality around what you open source, what you don't open source, where you draw those lines. It's intentionality around what interfaces do you create for the community to participate at what level of sophistication or technology. Like not everyone is a systems programmer that can dive deep and contribute to your project. So acknowledge that and build in other interfaces if you desire to create a community around your thing. And to Casey's point, you cannot be too early in being intentful on all those dimensions, including the monetization one.
Let's talk about drawing the line there for a second, because a lot of the companies I talk to are still figuring that one out too. Where do you tell people to draw? I mean, every company is different, but where do you generally tell people this should be the commercial product, this should be an open source? Because usually when I talk to them, it's single server, single sign-on, things like that, enterprise. But
yeah, I don't think there's any one right answer. It is the first question I always ask, like, have you figured out your business model yet before anyone's going to invest in you? But I've seen all kinds of different approaches to this. The classic is sort of like, okay, we'll be the ones that host it in the cloud and provide the manageability and security and reporting and observability, all the abilities, et cetera. That's like the classic case, I would say. There's also multi-server versus single, or in case of infrastructure, high performance, sort of mega scale versus running it for your own personal project. So those are the ones that we have seen the most commonly in the infrastructure layer.
I'll just add one more to that, which is if you think about community and building a community of developers around your project, developers love to scratch itches that they're trying to fix for themselves, right? Customer zero or dog fooding. And so you can think through that logically from a product architecture standpoint and say, okay, what do developers care about? What do they want to use? What do they want to spend time investing in? And then, if you're selling infrastructure or if you're selling into B2B scenarios, there's a whole bunch of capabilities and features and functionality that have budget that big central IT organizations pay money for that developers don't care about. Now, I'm sure I'm not going to offend anyone in the audience. I hope I don't offend anyone in the audience, but how many developers wake up every day to add functionality to SSO, right? Or add functionality to Skim? I'm sure there's some in the audience, God bless you, but most developers don't. That's not developer-facing functionality. But guess what? There's huge IT budgets for that type of corporate functionality, that's centralized visibility, control, and security. And you can keep that closed, and most of your community's not going to care, right? And so really, again, intentionality about where you draw those lines and what developers care about versus what they don't, broadly speaking, is one way to think through it.
Yeah, I think, kind of to your point, in the best way possible, developers are lazy. They don't want to build an SSO. They don't want to think about security features. And so, it obviously depends on the exact product you're building and what sort of layer of infrastructure that you are building for. But, you can be a cloud-hosted service, or you can go and build these other features and be sort of open core. And even some of the companies I work with, like Astral in the Python tooling space or Void Zero in the JavaScript space, those will remain open source, but over time, they will slowly layer in features that get them to high end of enterprise.
I thought we were shifting everything left and developers had to care about all of these things now. But you mentioned open core. Is that kind of the standard model you're seeing then right now from most companies that you're talking to?
It's some combination, usually of open core or just a cloud-hosted service of the project. I think most founders these days, they prefer to keep most of the functionality, and certainly the community cares about this as well. They want most of the features or all the features that are in the project to be in the cloud-hosted service. They just don't want to think about infrastructure. So that's usually the easiest path forward.
Sorry.
Well, I think on that point, it's worth noting that if a company is thinking about going open source, they're going to hit a tripwire at some point. And the tripwire is this definition where you want to monetize your product and protect your product against essentially monopolistic, competitors with overwhelming advantages, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera. And there really is, it's a, you're going to race towards building a community. It's awesome. We want to have everyone contribute. Developers want to download stuff for free and use it, et cetera, et cetera. But then at some point, you realize this business model is broken because somebody is able to take your code and ship it. And this is what I think Llama was concerned about. I mean, not that Facebook and team need more money, but like, well, they don't want to just give their code away to their competitors, so they put their protections in. And then that creates this situation where, again, you have this definitional problem where now all of a sudden you're not open source anymore. And then developers, I think, sort of look at that, who, if they're not in the industry or in the clergy, the open source clergy, they sort of go, well, that's it. It's not open source anymore. Even though the code is open, it's free, it's available for everyone to use, no matter what the use case, except if you're hosting it as a cloud service. This is like a real big tripwire that's been set up. And again, I think it's like we've gaslit everybody because it's actually not true. You can have a community project that is funded and supported by the community and also has a valid business model, as long as you evolve the definition of the open source evolve the open source definition, which hasn't yet happened. We were pretty hopeful, I would say, with the AI front, that it would evolve. And well, now it's not going to.
But to your point, like, how many people in the audience or how many developers like wake up and the first thing they do is check the OSI definition?
There's like 40 of them on Twitter.
Right?
I know their handles.
Right? And so, well, again, proof is going to be in the activity, the poll, the distribution, the excitement, the innovation around these projects. And I would say that is going to be what truth is, right, versus what's written down on paper.
Yeah, agreed.
Now, sometimes when I talk to startups that are trying to make that decision themselves about licensing and competing potentially with some of these hyperscalers, they'll say, well, we're just going to be better at running our own software, which is probably something you hear every now and then as, well, we don't have to worry about them because we're just so much better at running our own product. Is that
There's a graveyard
valid?
of startups that have said that. Yeah.
Well, and this, I mean, it gets back to like where are you going to draw the lines of what's open, what's not. Like the open single server as an example, okay, don't compete head-to-head on that, but if you hold back like multi-server, right, or caching across multiple environments, like you hold back some of that stuff, yeah, guess what? That's proprietary IP that you can have a hosted service that's better, but it depends on being very intentional about where you draw those lines. Running the same open source software that the hyperscalers have access to as well, yeah, good luck with that.
I think you always want to have something that you're doing in terms of either developer experience or maybe performance for multi-server orchestration, something like that. Going head to head with one of the hyperscalers on running exactly the same software is going to it's going to be nearly impossible. Obviously, they don't have the same exact community that you do. They're not at the front edge of it. They can't create the same developer experience or maybe even have the same performance benefits in the project, but I wouldn't recommend it. Yeah.
Now, maybe I'll just stand up for the hyperscalers for a moment here, so don't.
Wow.
But they will. I mean, I'll just play devil's advocate here. They'll say, but we're great contributors to all of these open source projects, and we want to help the community as well. I'm getting side eye from you guys here, but what's is there a redeeming quality to these companies?
I mean, certainly, some of them have actually gone and contributed significantly to open source projects, for sure. Microsoft is a great example of that. They've been a great partner to us, and I think so. It can be done, but it's not consistent. And again, if you don't have a protection in there, then you're always running that risk. And I think probably Google and Amazon have done good things too, right, across the boards. They certainly have contributed to Redis when it was open source. Not in a significant way, but they have contributed. But as soon as it came time to pay the piper in terms of, okay, hey, we actually want you to contribute so that we can continue to maintain the source code, because we did 95% of the contributions, that's when the doors closed.
And look, to be fair to the spirit of the question, and the hyperscalers, their ability to host what can be, in some cases, very complicated software and create it an environment that's easy to use without having to install, set up, configure, security. Like that's benefit. That creates a market, right? It creates a top of funnel in some cases of the market. And so there's real value in that in growing these markets. So it's a fair point, Frederick.
But you do have a monopoly issue. I mean, so you do have monopolies here who use the monopolies in unfair ways. And that is something that I think is not good for little tech. It's not good for innovation. It's not good for what's happening in AI. And it has to be fixed, in my view.
I think that's fair. Switching gears just a tiny bit, we talked about community quite a bit already in the last 20 minutes, but when you talk to startups, for example, how do you even start building an open source community? How do they think about that, and how should they think about it?
You know, some of the most exceptional open source communities, and certainly the ones in our portfolio that we see, they're all built by word of mouth. So the common factor, I'd say, for most very popular open source projects, and maybe you two can attest to this, is that they really are solving an individual developer's problem. And typically they're doing it very, very fast. I think even some of the most complex infrastructure open source projects, I like to think of it as you could do this, you could kind of implement this in your lunch breaks. You basically have up to an hour, but more realistically like 10 minutes to see if something's going to solve your problem. And so, you know, the way that the most incredible experience that you can create for a developer is just something that's like so fast or so simple that they almost question if it's working, right? And so I think those are really magical developer experiences. And then developers just talk to each other, whether it's in person or on different Reddit forums or in Discord community servers. They're very prolific with sharing tools that they love. And you start to see this real grassroots movement in the community, and that is sort of pops up in different ways, but that's typically what we see.
No, I love that, and I would only add to that, in addition to the magical experience, we call it less than 10 minutes to wow, is you have to approach the community very authentically if you really desire their contribution and participation. And that means not just speed and iteration and delivering value in the product, but speed in considering their pull requests, right? In hosting demos and hand-on hackathons, in showing them early snapshots of stuff that may be very raw and in alpha, and not for show, not performative, right? It's got to be like, we really want your feedback. Oh, look, we just put in this pull request, and 24 hours later, there it is again, right? And so community, maybe another way to say it is like community building has to be authentic. It cannot be performative for the sake of having a community, because for the sake of building distribution, you have to really want it and invest in it with intentionality. I think that's the new word of the panel. Right?
Love it.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of the companies I talk to will say we're open source, but you ask them if they're taking outside contributions. Right, they don't even do that, right? So that's it. But it can't just be build a good product. You say going out there. What about working with foundations, for example? Is that something useful, something startups should even consider? Like the Linux Foundation is the obvious example, I think. But
one of us are going to jump in that.
Rowan is making faces, so I want to hear what he...
I don't know. I mean, seems like they're doing important work over there, but I don't know exactly what it is.
Whoa.
No, I just don't. Actually, I'm not educated. I'm not saying that pejoratively.
Look, it's a wonderful question. Again, we could spend the rest of the panel on this, but as you scale and see success in your project, there are other market participants that will come at you, and you have a really interesting challenge, a strategic decision at that point. Because if they see enough value in what you're doing, you could run the risk of a fork, in which case you lose potential control. Or you're like, okay, can I effectively put this in a foundation, gather all these folks around, align enough, you're never going to align 100%, but align enough of incentives such that I maintain enough control, they're incented that we don't fork. And so there's a phenomenally strategic decision on the part of a company. Not exactly a one-way door, but it's pretty close to a one-way door. And so, God, I should just shut up, but I keep saying intentionality.
Keep going.
Intentionality, because if you don't do that and you fork, you're in a very different world. And so it's about what degree of control versus the risk of forking is kind of the inputs to that very sophisticated conversation and decision.
And we've just seen some startups just, maybe not even fork, but just take the code from others. open source project.
Who will remain nameless, at least by us, by the panelists. You can,
not any
your conference.
of you, but we've seen. I mean, forks have actually become a topic recently that we hadn't seen for a while. You mentioned Elastic, AWS as a fork of that. HashiCorp. A lot of companies have had to deal with that. If a company came to you right now and said, "We're forking an open source project," what would you say, Casey?
Let me think about that. I think. No, I think. Look, it really depends on the reason for the fork, because you are making a decision to move in a different direction from the existing community and potential governance structure of that. And so for me, it's a question of why are you doing that? Maybe I don't know. Maybe there's a huge disagreement. Maybe there's a fundamentally different thing you want to do. But I think I'd certainly have a lot of questions around why you are diverging from the community, because I think again the community is the most important part of all of these projects. And so when you're moving in a different direction from that, I think it's important to understand exactly why.
Right. Sometimes it's the community that's moving away from you.
Yeah, that too.
That might be a problem. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I just want to get us back to the original topic of the business model of open source. Like, what's next? Because it feels like we're at a bit of an inflection point right now. Like, where are you seeing the ecosystem going? Where are you seeing the business model going?
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime we go through these tech waves, right? Whether it's Moore's law or Metcalfe's law, like the physical forces underlying our industry every 8 to 10 years just blow up the stack. And we're in the midst of one of those explosions right now, which is fantastic, right? If you live for this industry. And so what that means is, if I'm an investor, like, what a great time to be investing in open source. Because the whole stack is coming up for grabs now. Asterisk, not in all parts, but. And so I think you're going to see, just like we talked about earlier, LLMs are not pure source code, and so now there's a whole discussion going on, like, what should the model be for that, and the community is going to decide, and businesses are going to decide. But that's not the only layer that's getting disrupted right now. And so I think we're going to see just an explosion of companies, explosion of different licensing models, and what a great time to be alive and in this industry.
As fans and contributors to the open source community, we really hope that this continues, and we think there are some issues that have to be resolved. I remain pretty hopeful that we'll get through that, because I just think it's too good for the industry for it to go away. Exactly. Even though there are challenges, you also do see very successful companies emerge with open source models, despite everything that we've said today. So I think it's, and we'll see what happens with this AI evolution, and what Facebook has to say about the recent sort of decree, but I don't know. Like I remain hopeful and optimistic actually about the future of open source.
I'm sorry, Casey.
Oh, go ahead.
I say, look, open source has been the catalyst for innovation. And you look back, historians will look back 200 years from now. Like, open source has been the catalyst for innovation in this century, right? And like, why can't we not just expect more and more and even greater outcomes from that?
I think developer preference has
go.
Shifted, and in most cases, to build a big company now, a lot of software exists. You need interoperability with those tools. Open source is an incredible way to do that. It's an incredible way to get distribution very, very fast, and we're seeing that. Actually, most interestingly, at a global scale now, you can get distribution globally. So.
Great point.
All right, open source is not going away, but we are. Our time is up.
We are.
Well, we all. Ending on a bummer here. Thank you all so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.